COP28, 6 themes. It's all about the money. Theme number 1, stimulating a course correction for climate action. Hi, I'm Michelle Stirling for Friends of Science Society, and Robert Lyman has prepared some summaries of 6 themes that he sees as being the most important in the upcoming COP28 climate conference that will be held in fabulous Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Now, of course, Dubai couldn't exist without oil and gas and coal to make all those fabulous buildings and pour all that cement. But one of the things that people are going to be trying to address at COP28 is the phase out of fossil fuels, if you can believe it. But that's not the theme that we're going to deal with today. It's one that we will look at later on in this series. Now, the Conference of the Parties, that's what COP stands for. These are the countries that signed on to the UNFCCC, that means United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, back in 1994. And that was 2 years after the Rio conference in Rio de Janeiro. One of the highlights of those conferences, or that conference and that convention, is that this is where the notion that human emissions from industry are dangerous to the environment. You won't find that subjective word in the actual definition of climate change in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the scientific arm, although it's quite political, of course, because it's all about governments, but you will find it in the UNFCCC definition of climate change. So there's these two competing definitions, and Roger Pielke Jr. has written a paper about it, I think it was in 2005, 2006, called Misdefining Climate Change. And he noted that there are consequences for climate and policy depending on which definition you choose. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through these COP28 themes that Robert Lyman has outlined for us. So I'm just going to read through what Robert wrote. We've put it together in a little PowerPoint. Robert Lyman was a former public servant, federal public servant in Canada for 27 years, diplomat for 10 years. He worked on GHG-related files almost all of his career, so he's very well informed on these matters. So, with no more ado, let us continue. So it's all about the money. The 6 themes of COP28. Stimulating a course correction for climate action. That's the one we'll be looking at today. I'm also going to be doing delivering on promises made to the developing world, phasing out fossil fuels, laying the foundation for exponential growth in renewables, scaling up accountability, and delivering for nature and people. Those are the 6 themes that Robert Lyman has outlined as being critical to the COP28 conference. Stimulating a course correction for climate action. The goal is using the recently completed global stock take on the performance, in fact, failure of countries to reduce emissions fast enough to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. The conference will seek to bring political pressure to bear on countries to adopt more stringent emissions reduction policies, both pre-2030 and pre-2035. And so, of course, this is all premised on the theory that emissions from human industry are dangerous and that they are the sole cause of warming. Not everyone agrees with that premise. So many people don't agree with it, and those who don't agree with it will point out that reducing carbon dioxide will not be the thermostat of the world. It won't necessarily stop global warming, and it may be trillions of dollars wasted for such an effort. chasing kind of a mythical unicorn, if you like. But let's continue. Stimulating a course correction for climate action, let's look at the factual background. At the 2015 COP, that was in Paris, the parties agreed that they would submit 5-year plans indicating which actions they would voluntarily take to reduce greenhouse gas GHG emissions. These plans are called the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. The UN stocktake was intended to be an assessment based on the NDCs and the measurement of GHG emissions reductions achieved to date, of how well the parties were doing in seeking to reduce emissions so as to meet the aspirational goal of limiting the rise in average global temperature to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. So this is the report that they're referring to. It's called the Production Gap, Phasing Down or Phasing Up. Top fossil fuel producers plan even more extraction despite climate promises. And you can see there's a number of very activist groups associated with this. The IISD is a Canadian charity. Its revenues are about $29 million, and about 20 million of that comes from foreign funding. So I think questions should be asked about that, but that's unrelated to this at the moment. So here's the cover of the report: Phasing Down or Phasing Up. Top fossil fuel producers plan even more extraction despite climate promises. So the emissions gap. The stocktake document prepared for the meeting instead included primarily a litany of exhortations for more emissions reduction action and more spending and central planning by governments. Its main stocktake conclusion was that based on current NDCs, nationally determined contributions, the gap in emissions consistent with limiting warming is about 20.3 billion tons, or gigatons, to 23.9 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. The report urged more ambition in order to reduce GHG emissions by 43% by 2030 and a further 60% by 2035 compared with 2019 levels, and to reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2050 globally. So let's see how they've been doing all these years. So this is a graph of the rise in atmospheric CO2 concentration, carbon dioxide, and this is a list of all of the climate conferences that have been had over the years. It doesn't have the upcoming one on it. It doesn't have Sharm el-Sheikh on here, but this gives you a pretty good idea that it's not working. And the thing is, the non-OECD nations won't stop growing. So why is that relevant? Let's just take a moment here while I explain this. Basically, in the original UNFCCC agreement, the world was split into developing nations and developed nations or industrialized nations. Most of the industrialized nations are OECD nations, the Organization of Economic Development, whatever it's called anyway, and the non-OECD nations are the developing or emerging nations. So at the time that the 1994 UNFCCC framework was signed by many of these countries, China really was a developing nation. And of course, today, China is running neck and neck with the US as the world's biggest industrial power. So things have changed radically, but not the framework. So the framework doesn't address these changes in the world. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as we go through this. So the non-OECD nations won't stop growing. the stock take neglected to mention important facts. The governments of the world have been setting increasingly stringent greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets since 1992. Global greenhouse gas emissions, as measured in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent, were almost 60% higher in 2019 than they were in 1990. Over the period 2010 to 2019, the country members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, those are the developed nations, reduced their GHG emissions from energy consumption from 13 gigatons per year to 12 gigatons per year, or 8%. During the same period, the non-OECD countries increased their emissions from 18.1 gigatons per year to 22.2 gigatons per year, or 23%. Non-OECD emissions thus rose 4 times as fast as OECD emissions fell during this period. In 2022, the non-OECD countries produced almost 70% of the global GHG emissions, a share that is constantly increasing. Stimulating a course correction for climate action, well, it's going to be pretty difficult. So what are the prospects? So first of all, let's just have a look at this graph over here. This is from Our World in Data, Global Primary Energy Consumption by Source. And you can see here that wind is the thin, dark blue line. Solar, modern biofuels, and other renewables are stacked on top of that. Hydropower is the fatter blue line below it, and nuclear is the turquoise blue line below that. And all the rest, well, it's natural gas, this kind of purpley color here. Oil, this kind of pinky, peachy color, and coal, and then traditional biomass. So it doesn't look like we're reducing emissions. So the prospects for this objective of COP28. Robert writes, "It is possible that during or after the conference, some countries will announce more ambitious targets for emissions reduction. If so, these announcements will be prominently reported by the media. In fact, with the possible exception of the OECD countries, no major country or country groupings is likely to come any closer to reducing global emissions than they have in the past. Global emissions will continue to grow until at least 2040 and beyond, and the goal of reducing global emissions to net zero by 2050 will not even remotely be met." So, in conclusion, COP28 will be an immense media event, and like its predecessors, an exercise in grand theater that is intended to elevate the general public's concern about the alleged dangers of human-induced climate change. The fact that over 70,000 people will attend the event will raise its profile. The background factual analysis rarely, if ever, supports the claims of impending catastrophe or the justifications of the measures being promoted by the United Nations, the European Union, and other groups. And look at this fabulous man-made island. You don't make that with wind and solar. So the reality of COP28? Well, the simple reality is that nothing that is done or agreed at the conference will change the inexorable growth in the global population, economy, and energy use, and therefore in GHG emissions due to developments in the poorer countries. The UN will seek to create new institutions, funds, and mandates that will expand its authorities and influence. And it may succeed in some respects, but it remains highly unlikely that the developed countries will agree to provide the trillions of dollars annually that the UN and the developing countries are seeking. Without this, the net zero emissions goal by 2050 will not be met. So stay tuned for more. This is the first part, stimulating a course correction for climate action. We've got all these to go through. I'll be doing one on each of them, delivering on promises made to the developing world, phasing out fossil fuels, laying the foundation for exponential growth in renewables, scaling up accountability, and delivering for nature and people. So if you like our work, please donate and help us continue. This is our main website. You can see much more about climate science there and many policy papers. And if you want to send us an e-transfer, that's probably the quickest way. You can also become a member at our main website, or you can donate there as well. Thanks very much for watching this short little video. I appreciate the fact that you took the time. Now, and one other thing. A lot of people think, oh, these COP conferences, you know, all the environmental groups go there, everybody has a flashy holiday in a nice warm place in the middle of winter, but it doesn't mean anything for me. But it does, because things like the carbon tax in Canada, things like the clean fuel standard, things like the clean electricity standard, things like the heat pump controversy, all these things come out of the succession of all the previous 27 COP conferences. So keep an eye open and learn more about this and learn how to push back if you disagree with these. Obviously, it's not going to be a cakewalk to cut emissions by the extraordinary objectives that the COP people have set out in that report that I mentioned, in the the production gap. It's just not possible without literally destroying Western society. So it's serious. So think about it. Again, thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back with the rest of the segments to inform you a bit more about what's going on at COP28. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Stirling, and a big thank you to Robert Lyman for putting the information together.